The sound that first alerted the landlady wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the steady, unending hiss of a water tap left running for hours. Inside the bathroom of a modest New Jersey boarding house, a scene of quiet horror waited. A young woman, just 24 years old, lay submerged in the cold water of the tub, her head beneath the faucet. On a nearby chair, her clothes were folded with an almost chilling precision. A note sat on a small table, its shaky handwriting telling a story of despair and a life given up. To the world, it was a clear-cut tragedy. A troubled soul named O.C. Sneed had finally found a desperate peace. But for one man, the county physician who first examined the body, the scene wasn't one of tragedy, it was a stage. It was too neat, too perfect. And that raises the bone-chilling question we're here to answer today. If O.C. Sneed didn't write that note, who did? And if she didn't take her own life, who held her head beneath the water until it was over? Otelia Gilmer Sneed, known to all as Ose, was a ghost long before she died. She was the very picture of turn-of-the-century Southern beauty, delicate, with eyes that held a deep and searching sadness. For a brief, fleeting moment, she had a life of her own. She married a man she loved and gave birth to a daughter, a small flicker of warmth in what had been a cold and controlled existence. That little family was her world, her one chance at a life defined by her own choices and her own happiness. But O.C. was born into a dynasty in decay. Her mother, Caroline, and her two aunts, Virginia and Mary, were the last vestiges of a proud Virginia family whose fortunes had withered like autumn leaves. They lived on the edge of Appalachia, in a world where the memory of wealth was a heavier burden than poverty itself. They were women forged in the fires of Southern pride, a pride that could curdle into something monstrous when faced with the shame of destitution. They saw Oates's simple happiness not as a blessing, but as a betrayal of their ambitions. And so they began the slow, methodical work of dismantling her world. They were a trio of spiders, weaving a web of concern and manipulation around her. They convinced O.C. that her husband was unworthy, that motherhood was too great a strain for her delicate health. They pried her away from her husband, and then, most cruelly, from her own child. They moved her from city to city, a traveling invalid with no anchor and no friends, only her three ever-present caretakers. The true poison they fed her wasn't in a bottle, it was in their whispers. They told her she was sick, and so she was. They told her she was a burden, and so she became one. They told her she was fragile, and her spirit became as brittle as spun glass. They isolated her from anyone who might offer a kind word or a dissenting opinion, until their voices were the only ones she could hear. This was the world that was lost, not just the life of a 24-year-old woman, but the life she was never allowed to live. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage of family duty, a beautiful, gentle soul who was systematically broken down by the very women who should have protected her. The tragedy wasn't just what happened in that bathtub. It was the slow, deliberate murder of her spirit that had been going on for years. To the first officers on the scene, it looked like an open and shut case, a sad but simple story written in the objects left behind. The laudanum bottle, nearly empty, the drinking glass, and the note, the final desperate period on a life sentence of sorrow. The scene was a still life of despair, carefully arranged and presented. But it was that very care, that meticulous neatness, that began to unravel the whole story. Suicide is an act of chaos, a final, violent tearing of the soul. This was something else entirely. It was clean. It was orderly. It was a performance. Dr. William Mackenzie, the county physician, was a man who understood death. He'd seen it in all its forms, violent, peaceful, accidental, and self-inflicted. And as he stood in that cold, damp bathroom, his professional instincts were screaming that this was wrong. He noted the position of O.C.'s body, the lack of any real disarray. He looked at the neatly folded clothes on the chair. Who folds their clothes before drowning themselves? It was a small detail, but it was a crack in the story. a tiny fissure through which a horrifying truth would begin to seep. The true wilderness in this case wasn't a forest of trees, but a wilderness of lies. The clues weren't tracks in the mud, but inconsistencies in human behavior. The two elderly aunts, Virginia and Mary, were putting on a symphony of sorrow that somehow rang false. Their wails seemed rehearsed, their grief too theatrical for the quiet, grim reality of the room. Dr. Mackenzie watched them, and the cold knot of suspicion in his gut tightened. He sensed he was not in the presence of mourners, but of actors who had just finished their final scene. The bathroom offered no easy answers. Instead, it presented a series of unsettling questions. Why was the scene so pristine? Why did the women's grief feel so hollow? And most importantly, as doctor, Mackenzie looked at the shaky, uncertain script of the suicide note. He couldn't shake the feeling that O.C. Sneed was not the author of her own death. The room was silent now, the water turned off, but for the doctor, the air was thick with whispers of a crime too monstrous to yet be named. In any story like this, the first shadow of suspicion always falls on the husband. And O.C. Sneed had a husband, a man she had once loved, the father of her child, a man who had been systematically and surgically cut out of her life by her family. He was the outsider, the one person who stood to gain nothing from her death, but everything from her life. Yet in the twisted logic of a murder investigation, this made him the perfect first suspect. The story the family told was a compelling one. They painted a picture of a rough, unsuitable man, someone who wasn't worthy of their Virginian aristocracy. They had, in their telling, rescued Otzi from a disastrous marriage. They were protecting her. But the lawmen had to wonder, what does a man do when his wife and child are stolen from him? Does he walk away? Or does a deep and poisonous bitterness begin to take root in his soul? The motive was as old as the mountains themselves, a heart turned to stone by jealousy and rejection. The whispers would have started immediately. He couldn't have her, so he made sure no one else could either. Perhaps he had been trying to get her back, and in a final, desperate confrontation, his rage had boiled over. It was a simple, brutal explanation that made a certain kind of sense. He was the spurned lover, the classic villain in a tale of love gone wrong. Investigators would have looked into him, searching for any sign of instability, any threat he might have made. Every letter he sent, every desperate plea to see his own daughter would now be re-examined through a sinister lens. Was it the plea of a loving father, or the obsession of a stalker? The family's wall of silence would have ensured that every memory of him was tainted, every action twisted into something menacing. He was the easy answer, the convenient scapegoat whose presence allowed everyone to avoid looking at the far more unthinkable possibility waiting in the shadows. But the husband was a ghost, a convenient shadow to chase while the real danger sat knitting in the parlor. The most chilling twists in any story come not from an enemy at the gate, but from a traitor at the table. And in Otzi Sneed's life, the table was surrounded by her own blood. No one would ever suspect the very women who had sworn to protect her. Her mother, Caroline, her quiet aunt, Mary, and the undeniable center of their dark little universe, her other aunt, Virginia Wardlaw. Virginia was a woman carved from granite. A former headmistress of a prestigious school, she carried herself with an imperious authority that bent others to her will. She wasn't just the matriarch of the family, she was its absolute monarch. To be in her presence was to feel a quiet, terrifying gravity, a force that pulled you into her orbit and held you there. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, but her mind had turned inward, consumed by a single, poisonous obsession. The secret motive wasn't a crime of passion. It was the cold, chilling arithmetic of greed. The family's pride was all they had left, and it was a poor substitute for the wealth they'd lost. Otzi, in their eyes, was not a daughter or a niece. She was an asset, a walking, breathing vessel to be converted into cash. Over months, they had taken out more than a dozen life insurance policies on her, a web of future payments totaling over $32,000. In 1909, that wasn't just a fortune, it was a resurrection. It was the price of their beautiful, fragile Ossie, and a price they were more than willing to pay. Suddenly, every act of care they had shown her was cast in a sinister new light. Separating her from her husband wasn't protection, it was isolating the asset. Moving her from town to town wasn't for her health, it was to keep her away from prying eyes. Their constant whispers that she was sick and tired of living weren't words of comfort. They were psychological warfare, preparing the ground for the suicide they were planning. Their grief, which had seemed so theatrical to the doctor, was now revealed for what it was: the final, triumphant act of a play they had been writing for years. But there was a third player in this tragedy, a silent partner whose motives were not born of passion or family pride, but of cold, impersonal commerce. This threat didn't come from the shadowed hollers of Virginia, but from the gleaming office buildings of the North. It was the burgeoning, rapacious world of the life insurance industry. In the early 1900s, this was a new and powerful game in America, a system that allowed you to place a wager on a human life and, for the right price, profit from its end. This was not a single man in a city suit, but an army of them. Eager agents, hungry for commissions, who saw these three refined Southern ladies not as potential killers, but as a respectable source of income. They likely never questioned why this family was so keen on insuring their frail, sickly niece. They never raised an eyebrow as one policy was stacked upon another, and then another, until Ossie Sneed's life was worth a king's ransom. Why would they? The premiums were being paid, and that's all that mattered. This external force provided the ultimate impersonal motive. To the insurance companies, Ossie was not a woman with hopes and a lost child. She was Policy 74B, a name on a ledger, a set of actuarial tables, a risk to be calculated. The system itself, in its relentless pursuit of profit, created the very weapon the family needed. It transformed Ossie from a human being into a financial instrument, an investment waiting to mature. This corporate entity created a climate of deadly opportunity. It gave Virginia Wardlaw the tools and the incentive to turn her dark thoughts into a workable plan. The insurance men didn't hold Ossie's head under the water, and they bore her no ill will. But their contracts, signed and sealed with a fountain pen, were the death warrant. They were the faceless, unknowing accomplices who built the gallows, handed over the rope, and then turned a blind eye, content to simply count their money. The law, my friends, tends to move in straight lines, and the straightest line of suspicion pointed directly at Ossie's estranged husband. In the days following the discovery, the telegram wires began to hum with his name. Here was a man with a clear, understandable motive: the rage of a spurned husband and a father denied his child. A posse, either literal or figurative, was sent to track him down. They expected to find a monster consumed by rage. Instead, they found a man hollowed out by loss. The promising trail evaporated into a puff of cold Appalachian air. Ossie's husband was hundreds of miles away, his presence confirmed by a dozen clock-punching factories.